A vision to tackle the world's climate crisis. Year after year, activists and scientists chalk out plans for nations to cut emissions. But are climate conferences achieving their objectives? And what are the challenges being faced by developing nations and climate offenders? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. China, India, and Indonesia have shown some of the biggest increases in emissions, according to a report released at a UN conference. Climate scientists meeting in Azerbaijan are setting new targets to cut emissions and work out a plan on how rich nations can help achieve the goals. Financing has been one of the main sticking points at the COP-29 climate conference in Baku. The data comes as climate activists are growing increasingly frustrated with what they see as the talks' inability to clamp down on the use of fossil fuels. And they accuse governments and companies of promoting rather than curbing them. So, what action can the world's developing nations take to curb pollution and tackle climate change? And at what cost? We'll put this question and more to our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Sarah Gill.
Activists have a clear message for developed nations at this year's UN Climate Summit.
COP-29 is a finance COP. We need more financing for the vulnerable nations. We need to make sure that the vulnerable nation will not just suffer again and again and again.
The conference is being hosted in Azerbaijan's capital, and experts have estimated that poor nations will need at least $2.4 trillion a year to mitigate the effects of climate change. It's a hefty price tag, but there's optimism.
We understand the political and financial constraints. But let me make 2 points. First, these numbers may sound big, but they are nothing compared to cost of inaction. This investment pays off. And second, we are all in this together.
Away from the meeting halls, the climate crisis is no longer a distant threat for some countries. Pakistan is one of the world's most climate vulnerable nations, and it's still feeling the effects of devastating floods in 2022 that killed 1,700 people and forced millions from their homes. In recent days, surging air pollution in the country's second largest city of Lahore has sparked a public health emergency, a man-made disaster that spared no one.
If you go to the doctor, everyone there has either a cough, illness, runny nose, a cold. Everyone is having these symptoms, so there's a high risk at the moment. And because of smog, business has really slowed down.
Lahore is in the province of Punjab. That's a farming and manufacturing hub. Fuel emissions from factories and vehicles have been a major problem for decades. They've been made worse by farmers burning fields each year to prepare for new crops. But developing nations like Pakistan say, without sufficient funding for climate protection, they have no way to boost their economy. Neighbouring India says it has the same problem. Its Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, was noticeably absent from COP, and he wasn't the only one. Heads of states from some of the wealthiest countries responsible for much of the world's greenhouse emissions, like the US and China, have also not attended, raising serious questions about their commitment in the fight against climate change. Sarah Gill, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In Baku, Suzanne Lynch, Associate Editor with Politico Europe. In New Delhi, Abhiir Bhalla, Youth Environmentalist. And in Perth, Peter Newman, Professor of Sustainability at Curtin University. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Suzanne, let me start with you today. Climate finance is a central focus of COP29. You are there in Baku. Is that the main policy objective this year, and what is the target this time around?
Yes, it certainly is. Money is the focus of this meeting here in Baku, with the international community coming together to try and work out a target for climate finance. And that's about developed countries doing their bit to finance countries that are most impacted by climate change. Now, it's all about the figure. What are these negotiators going to arrive at? In the last few days, we've heard calls for a new target of over $1 trillion per year, $1 trillion per year until 2030. That's what some UN figures are calling for here. But whether they agree to that figure, it seems quite a big leap from the existing targets. So this is what they're going to be working out here, negotiators, over the next week or so.
Yeah, Suzanne, when it comes to negotiations, I wanted to ask you about that, because from your vantage point, how wide does the gap remain between what developing countries need in order to combat climate change and what the developed countries are actually willing to give?
Yeah, well, at the moment, we're about halfway through the COP talks, and usually at this stage, we would start seeing a bit of momentum. But really, the gap at this point is quite large between what these developing countries are asking for and what the developed world are prepared to give. Now, some of this is to do with public finance constraints in a lot of countries. For example, in Europe, we have a new incoming administration now in the United States, and people don't know about the commitments that are going to be coming forth from the United States. And then what will other countries do if the United States was to pull back in any way? So they're the kind of big political financial questions that these countries need to ask themselves. What we're going to see over the next few days is that environment ministers from across the world are going to land here early next week and really try and get this a deal over the line. Now, it's supposed to finish next Friday, but these talks could go on after that. But at the moment, quite a big gap, but they've still got a chance to try and come up with some kind of compromise position.
Abhiir, there's a new report that released at COP-29 that says that China, India, and Indonesia have shown some of the biggest increases in emissions from 2022 to 2023. Right now in New Delhi, where you are, all primary schools are closed to in-person classes until further notice. The government has banned non-essential construction in the city, and it's also urged residents to avoid burning coal for heating. All of this in order to combat worsening air quality. There's terrible smog all around. How bad exactly is the situation?
Well, the situation with air pollution in Delhi is absolutely dismal right now. And I'm sorry to say that it wasn't unexpected at all. For the last at least 7 or 8 years, we've been seeing that year after year, the air quality in India and the Indo-Gangetic Plain across North India tends to deteriorate between the months of October to February. And that's been happening year after year. At the same time, as you said, India and China have increased their emissions drastically over the past year. And I think it's important to take note of the fact, the same argument that India has been making at the COPs, that we need to look at per capita emissions, because India is one of the lowest per capita emitters. But yes, the bottom line is that our emissions are going up, unfortunately, and they will continue to go up until and unless we get that climate finance support that we so desperately need. On air pollution, the government is implementing a slew of measures, when it comes to industries, when it comes to roadways and transport. But we need something that is not a stopgap. We need something that is not a temporary fix. And for that, I think the answer lies in transitioning to renewable and transitioning to green hydrogen, which the government is trying to increase focus on.
Abhiir, I want to focus for a moment about how personal this issue is for you. You are a youth environmentalist. I've read where you said that you were diagnosed with bronchitis as a child due to air pollution exposure. Obviously, like so many other environmentalists and activists of your generation, the future, the climate crisis and how it will impact the future, this is all very personal. I want you to tell us a little bit more about your story and how you got involved in all of this.
Absolutely. So, back when I was in class 6, about maybe 10 or 11 years ago, I used to be very indifferent about climate change. I used to think, much like a certain former US president, I used to think that climate change is a hoax. I used to think that it's not my problem to deal with. But that's when I woke up to the reality of Delhi's air quality, and I realized that the toxic AQI the numbers that we see crossing 500 is our day-to-day reality, and it's not just adversely affecting my health, but that of everyone I know and hold so dearly around me in my life. So that's when I sort of found this personal call to action and decided that I wanted to do something. Since then, of course, it's been one step after the other. I joined the Environment Club in my school. 3 or 4 years after that, I started a 4-year-long initiative with the Delhi Metro, which then went on to win me several accolades and recognition from the world over. And finally, I've been working as a freelancer, and now my day job with a Big Four consultant accounting firm also has me working as a sustainability advisor to the chairman. But on your point, very quickly, I think it's very important for each and every one of us to find our personal call to action when it comes to climate change, because we're stuck in this vicious cycle where we're blaming the government, we're blaming corporates, and of course 80% of the change will come from them. But I always argue that the first 20% has to come from society, and for that to happen, each of us has to find out how climate change is affecting us and why we care. So very often in my advocacy talks and my workshops, the focus of my messaging is why you should care, rather than giving them all these massive scientific numbers, which people just tend to forget afterwards.
Peter, these COP-29 talks, they are focused more on finance than previous COP-29 sessions. What do you say to that? Can developed countries, from your vantage point, be convinced to give more than they've given in the past, and to ensure that those finance goals that have been set are actually met going forward?
Well, it is very important that the developed world does contribute to the developing world in the finance that's needed, particularly about adaptation. But the developed world has to be the ones who do the most in terms of getting rid of fossil fuels and creating a world that is net zero, because they're doing most, and have done in the past, most of the emissions. And that's where the good news lies in the world of finance, because today we have so far invested $2 trillion in the net zero economy for mostly in the developed world, but increasingly in the developing world, to actually make this transition. It's $2 trillion now. So talking about billions into trillions is exactly what's needed for the governments. But the private sector finance world, 70% of the money in the world for net zero is coming from private finance and is being invested in solar, batteries, electric vehicles, wind power, the technologies that are now commercial. They are cheaper than doing it any other way. So any new investment is moving more and more towards net zero. So we are getting much more happening now, that we are turning around quicker than many people thought. In the IPCC, and I've been there 15 years, we were not as clear on what could quickly happen if private finance got involved in this. It's not just governments, it's the private world as well.
Peter, let me also ask you about the fact that at COP28 last year, Australia committed to transitioning away from fossil fuels, as did other countries. But like many other countries that are climate offenders, Australia still continues to greenlight new gas projects, right?
Yeah, there is an issue with gas, and particularly in my own state of Western Australia, where we have a lot of gas, and we think that there's going to be increasing need for gas as part of the transition. It's nonsense, and the world of private finance is showing that as well, because they are not investing nearly as much because the market is going down. This is the sign we've got to pick up and run with. those companies that think they can continue to expand gas are going to collapse. And countries that depend on that for their money will suffer because they are not the future. The net zero transition is happening and gas is going to phase out along with coal. Coal's already disappearing. And the reality is, even in our own town in Perth, nearly 80% of the power is now coming from solar and wind. It is not the world of coal is disappearing very rapidly. Gas is meant to be the transition, but it's not going to be for long. Solar and wind are weird.
Suzanne, let me ask you, the countries in the world that are climate offenders, what kinds of challenges do they face in all of this?
Well, I mean, one of the issues that's always been here at COP is this divide between countries. Those countries that have been historically the most developed over the centuries and have been the biggest emitters versus those countries that haven't been and yet are the most impacted by climate change. That's the overriding division that comes through every single annual meeting of COP. So, I mean, I think what's happened is not only do the developed countries realise they need to give more, but also we've got other countries who weren't originally included in the list that was constructed back in the 1990s as developed countries, who some people believe now should contribute, i.e. China, or a lot of the Gulf states. So there's going to be also a debate, not about just how much money that needs to be agreed on at this COP summit, but also about who should be contributing to that money. So that's another part of the debate that's happening here. But we do see, I mean, it's one of the positives about COP is that we do have this huge range of countries here who are all negotiating. They try and put political divisions aside and come to this kind of a shared consensus agreement. Big delegation here from China, for example, big presence from the Gulf countries, for example, the UAE, which obviously hosted COP last year in Dubai. So these are the kinds of countries that are becoming, I think, a bit more vocal in recent years at these COP gatherings here. Now, their negotiators will be in the rooms where I am here and trying to give their side of the story, trying to make sure that they're happy with the agreement that's coming out of this gathering. But as I say, most countries in the world are representative here. And then, of course, you have countries in Europe who negotiate more like as a bloc, as the EU, for example, or small island countries that tend to negotiate as a bloc. But they're the kind of dynamics that are happening here at this meeting.
Abhiir, climate activists are growing increasingly frustrated with what they see as the talks' inability to clamp down on fossil fuels and the countries and the companies that promote them. You've attended several climate-related conferences. In your opinion, and from your experience, do conferences and meetings like COP-29 and others actually make a difference?
Well, it's actually a bit of a double-edged sword, to be very honest, because on one hand, I think conferences like the COPs, conferences like the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, do put a lot of emphasis on climate finance or on the climate challenge at large. And in doing so, by inviting different stakeholders, whether it's the largest companies in the world, whether it's oil and gas manufacturers, whether it's nonprofits, whether it's private citizens or governments, they're providing a big avenue to exchange best practices, exchange regional learnings, and even opportunities for fundraising, actually, which others don't actually end up getting in a domestic context, right? On the other hand, there is, of course, the age-old criticism with the COPs that world leaders are spending massive amounts of, carbon emissions and spending a lot on fuel flying to these conferences when they could just as easily be on a Zoom call. And the second criticism, of course, that also exists, which is a slightly more pessimistic one, is the fact that some of the younger climate activists are of the opinion that, governments are increasingly using COP as an opportunity to sort of appease the local climate movements in their countries, right? So the governments will say, okay, hold off on your protest. We see your point. Why don't you come and speak about this at COP? You deserve recognition. And then they actually use it as a leverage. They actually use it as an opportunity to solve the problem domestically, give them a platform internationally, and then that never ends anywhere, you know. But all in all, if I'm to give you a summative answer, I think these conferences do have a definite positive outcome. I think they are much needed to hold countries accountable. They are the sort of flag in the ground for an annual progress check. This year, for example, we're looking at the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, which hasn't been discussed since the 100 billion commitment was made 15 years ago, back in 2009. So the COPs are necessary, but I think, and I'll end with that, we also need to give enough focus to the SBs that happen in Bonn, which is the precursor to COP, which doesn't get half as much as attention. So that's just as important. We need to look at the meetings leading up to it. And we also need to start leveraging other meetings, right? Like last year, the G20 did a very good job of laying the base for some of the key agreements that were signed at COP28. So we need to start looking at other platforms and leveraging those as well for the climate fight.
Peter, you heard Abhiir there talk about other agreements in the past and other meetings. I want to ask you more specifically about the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015. That calls for limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. Where does that stand? What's the report card from your vantage point on all that?
Well, that was a pretty remarkable event because no one really expected it. It came at a point where the world was really needing to get a handle on climate change, and we'd failed in the previous one that had happened in Copenhagen. It was almost abandoned. And then along came Christiana Figueres, who ran an event which brought together environmental groups and business groups to sort it out and produce what was called a transition roadmap, which they agreed on. So when they gave that to governments, what can they say? I mean, the private sector and environmental groups are agreeing. So there was this massive commitment of 197 countries to make a start. Now, that's all that was required, and each year, or every 5 years, there's a ratcheting up mechanism. And next February, is the fifth year in the series. And that will be when we get even more commitments being made to achieve it. So that's the journey we're on. And it might seem slow, but there is a lot happening. And as I keep saying, the finance world is recognising that this is a world that must happen. We cannot afford to get hotter and hotter in our... insurance alone is going to kill our economies. So we have to make the change. And they are putting in those steps. But it does seem very slow, and from the outside looking in, like we tend to be, us commentators, it could go a lot faster and there should be more money and all that. But it is getting somewhere.
Suzanne, heads of states from some of the wealthiest countries responsible for much of the world's greenhouse emissions, like the US and China, have also chosen not to attend COP-29. What kind of message does that send?
I think that is a huge dynamic here, to be honest, and I think it's it has a negative impact. I mean, when you have some of the world's biggest polluters not bothering to show up at head of state level, that is a problem. And also even from Europe, like French President Macron, the German Chancellor, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, they all have chosen to stay away. And when they do stay away, other people step into their space in a sense. So, for example, in Europe, we've had people like Viktor Orban and Giorgia Meloni who are more on the right of the debate, and they have spoken here, been quite prominent. So has Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, and has really cast Britain as a leader in this. But it certainly does make an impact. Obviously, the United States is in a particular historical moment. It's a transition. The Biden administration does have people here. We have heard from the U.S. Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, today, and the Agriculture Secretary is coming next week. But of course, the question is, are people really listening when they know that that administration is only going to be in power for the next couple of months? So, they're trying to be heard, but that is a problem. We do have a very big Chinese delegation here, one of the biggest. So, people might argue, well, you don't have to have the heads of state. You have negotiators. I do think it's also worth pointing out that, again, because of timing, this weekend, the G20 summit is going to get going in Rio, in Brazil. So people here in Baku, where I am now, will be wondering, will political leaders meeting there? So, for example, Joe Biden is meeting Xi Jinping in Lima this weekend. Will they get some kind of political signal from the highest levels over there to move ahead here, if you like? So there is that conversation going on. It's just not going on here, but that may well feed into the discussions that are happening here in the final week of COP.
Abhiir, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I want to ask you about an issue that has become a problem in places like Pakistan and India. The situation's been made worse by the fact that there are farmers that are burning fields each year to prepare for new crops. Developing nations say that without sufficient funding for climate protection, that they have no way to boost their economy. How much is that playing into all of this?
It's political fodder. It's nothing else. Because if you look at NASA data, if you look at any data that really exists, and this is true for most developing economies, the stubble burning season is just for maybe 25 or 30 days in a year, right? And the air pollution season, for lack of a better word, is for almost 4 or 5 months. So if you look at real data, it's actually vehicular emissions which are the primary cause of air pollution in places like India and Pakistan. And it is, atmospheric factors such as Western disturbances, which are escalating the issue to a scale which we don't see in the summer. It's dense air, it's polluted air which settles down. And it's being exacerbated by these meteorological factors. But the primary culprit is the fact that our vehicular emissions are going on increasing, our road dust, our construction emissions are going on increasing, and that's what needs to be addressed first. The stubble burning debate is very real, and it is a contributor. I'm not dismissing it, but it is what is used to fuel a political blame game between state governments and central governments. And to that end, there have been solutions that the government and other startups are providing at a low cost to farmers. There are biofertilizers, there are other solutions, but of course they need to be taken to scale.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Suzanne Lynch, Abhiir Bhalla, and Peter Newman. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.